Hello, my name is Dr. Joshua Lynch, and I would like to welcome you to my presentation, The Gregory Collection, a fresh look at a survey of Ozark Bluff shelters. Let's not waste time, 20 minutes is going to fly by, so we'll hop straight into things. I'd like to start with a little more formal introduction to myself. Like I said, my name is Dr. Joshua Lynch, but for many of you, this will be our first time getting to meet. I really look forward to being able to interact with many of you during the question and answer portion of this virtual conference. I'm really looking forward to becoming involved in the local Arkansas archaeological community. My background in archaeology is primarily related to Paleo-Indian and First Americans archaeology, with a real emphasis on lithic analysis and experimental archaeology. In the process of working 5 years as a full-time CRM archaeologist in interior Alaska, I also managed to expand into significant community outreach as a portion of the way that I approach archaeology. Without the community, it's hard to imagine our archaeology meaning very much. I'm excited to be here and working in the sort of archaeologically legendary Southeast. There's so much to do here, there's so much to learn, and I'm excited to have completed my first full year at Arkansas Tech University, where I've been able to start to explore some of the incredible research potential of this campus, of this region, and of this state. The Gregory collection, which has been housed at Arkansas Tech University since 1986, represents the results of an extensive amateur salvage survey in the Limestone Valley, central Boston Mountains, southwest Newton County. The Limestone Valley today may be known for the community of Limestone or as part of the winding path of the Big Piney Creek. The Gregory survey was designed to add to regional understandings and tying bluff shelter occupations to sites in the lowlands, but also this survey represented an attempt to salvage archaeology from the valley, a valley that by the late 1960s was already overrun with amateur archaeologists and looters who were quick to destroy sites rather than collect detailed information about the occupations of the hundreds of bluff shelters and dozens of open air sites that had been identified in the valley itself. The Limestone Valley is really representative of many different valleys through the Ozark region. As you can imagine, in the highlands, an oak hickory southern hardwood forest dominates, including small areas of southern pines and cedar growth along limestone bluff lines. The modern bottomlands have been mostly cleared, but interestingly and historically, there has been an extensive canebreak associated with this part of the Big Piney. Historically, the valley was known for having large populations of bear that occupied this canebreak, as well as abundant turkey and deer, and a full suite of small game in the Ozarks, as well as quail and dove. You can imagine that this place was attractive to all occupants of Arkansas through the long prehistory of the state. The extensive survey conducted by the Gregorys documented archaeological occupations in more than 100 of one of the most unique landscape features of the Ozark uplands. The Ozarks are geologically suited for the production of these bluff shelters, overhangs, and caves in a really unique way. Nearly 2,000 bluff shelters have been identified across the Arkansas Ozarks, though only a small portion of these have been professionally investigated. The Gregorys have given us a great head start into looking at the archaeology from numerous examples of these bluff shelter sites. Just as a little bit of background, the Breckenridge Dalton Point represents the earliest dated shelter use of these landscape features in Arkansas prehistory, dating to more than 9,500, 9,700 years ago. This date immediately caught my eye as a Paleo-Indian archaeologist, and especially an archaeologist who had also seen these style Dalton points in the Gregory collection. The remainder of this presentation will really hone in on discussing the Paleo-Indian transitional early archaic occupations of these bluff shelters. In general, we see an increased use of shelters and caves as food processing and storage locations across the state through the Archaic and the Woodland periods. This is also proven out in the Gregory collection, where there's extensive Middle, Early, Woodland, and Mississippian period archaeological collections. Those will be an increased focus of our research going forward. By the Mississippian period, we know that bluff shelters had taken on an increasing ceremonial role in the lifestyles of indigenous peoples in Arkansas. We see increased funerary presences in these locations, which continue through the prehistoric and contact period. If you're interested in more of the prehistory of these bluff shelters, I highly recommend you visit the survey website and check out their project dedicated to these Ozark Bluff shelters. It's a really incredible resource that's available not just for survey members, but the whole population, the whole state of Arkansas, and the world, who really train their eyes on these Ozark Bluff shelters to inform about regional prehistory. The Gregory collection at Arkansas Tech University, like I said, is a really incredible window into looking into this record of prehistory and this use of these unique landscape features in the Ozarks. The Gregory collection is incredible, not just because of the amazing assemblage of stone tools associated with the Gregory collection, but also because it preserves so many organic materials, cane basketry, cordage, bottle board fragments. These are things that we don't typically get to capture as southeastern archaeologists. These are perishable parts of the record that are often destroyed through the natural decaying processes, but are instead preserved in these bluff shelter sites. Being able to explore a more well-rounded toolkit for these foragers helps us get a better idea of what life was like in Arkansas during these early stages of prehistory. And when I say it gives a good representative example, I really mean it. It spans the full prehistory of Arkansas, or nearly. We've definitely identified several Dalton points. We'll return to talking about those, although Clovis in bluff shelters remains elusive. The Gregory collection is really made up of hundreds of projectile points, knives, and more than 1,000 chipstone artifacts, cores, early and late stage debitage, as well as brownstone tools. There are numerous church sherds, as well as faunal remains, including shells, skeletal elements of deer that have been transitioned into tools, as well as extensive skeletal remains that probably represent food events, and antler fragments that show wear patterns indicating they were used in flint knapping. Really excitingly, this Gregory collection also has an incredible record of perishables, corn, woven fiber artifacts, split cane artifacts, which I'm really interested in exploring as potentially parts of weapons toolkits. It's really common to produce dart points and arrows from these split canes, and I would be really interested in investigating those in the future. As we sort of narrow in on the research focus of this presentation, I was particularly drawn to investigating these Dalton points. Dalton assemblages in these Ozark Bluff shelters are relatively rare, and to have such a concentration of them in the Limestone Valley is really pretty incredible. There are a number of Dalton assemblages in the Gregory collection, including 4 bluff sites where Dalton points were identified, including Cow Creek Bluff, Long Bluff on Dukes Creek, Drury Bluff number 1, and Drury Bluff number 3. Now, 3 of those sites were documented as heavily disturbed in the 1960s by the Gregory, but at least one of these sites, state designation 03 NW 239, is reported as being in good condition and potentially preserving archaeological materials in situ. One of my primary research objectives in the coming year will be to revisit this archaeological site, hopefully produce some organic materials that can allow us to radiocarbon date the Dalton point documented here on the right side of your slide. There are also 2 open air Dalton sites in the Gregory collection, only one of which we'll discuss here. That site number is 03 Northwest 101, or as it's known in the Gregory collection, the Iris Bradley Field Site Salvage Recovery Area, which had the largest assemblage of Dalton points that we looked at in this particular collection, in this particular study. I would like to say that there is another site, Northwest 079, also known as Rattlesnake Bluff, that had a large assemblage of Dalton points. More than 25 Dalton points were discovered at this particularly large rock shelter, or this particularly large bluff site. And the Arkansas Archaeological Survey actually ran a great published piece in 2018 that really details all of the projectile point assemblages recovered at Rattlesnake Bluff. So I dug these Dalton points out of where they've been housed in these collections and immediately started to analyze them for use wear. I've looked at use wear in cave shelter settings from the Great Basin, and I was interested to compare the results that I saw at Smith Creek Caves and Bonneville Estate rock shelters to the kind of landscape use and subsistence techniques that we're seeing in the Ozark Bluff shelters as well. What's really fascinating about these bluff shelter Dalton points is the sheer accumulation of impact-related use wear damage. If we're asking the question, what kind of behavior is visible in these bluff shelter Dalton assemblages, which are really small, constrained to a few points here, a few points there, possible associated debitage, the story that really seems to be being told relates to the use of these projectile points as the use of these bifaces, I should say, as projectile points. We see characteristic impact damage. Fluting, sometimes it removes the whole face of these bifaces, ending in rolling fractures. We see impact fluting in multiple sites, as you can see here demonstrated. We also see the sort of step fracturing along the faces of these artifacts that we expect to see when they're used as hunting implements propelled at high velocities, much more so than when they're retouched extensively or used as knives. Interestingly, from Site 3 Northwest 362, I also seem to have identified a channel flake, which could suggest there's some light retooling happening in these rock shelters. There's not a lot of debitage associated with these points in the Gregory collection, but by going back to some of these sites, especially those that have more intact site area to be excavated, it might be possible to produce a more robust Dalton toolkit in these areas. But what we see documented, at least in the Gregory collection, are toolkits that seem to be exclusively dedicating to refurbishing, repurposing hunting tools in these upland bluff locations. That's particularly interesting when we compare that style use wear to the preliminary results that we're seeing from the open air shelter, or sorry, from the open air site in the bottomlands of the Limestone Valley. What we see at this site is a much more extensive collection of Dalton points in a variety of forms, with differential basis, with differential retouch to them, which I think is maybe the most interesting part of this collection. You can start to see the really heavily curated characteristics of Dalton points that you do not see in the bluff shelter sites, where you can imagine that projectile points are catastrophically failing and being replaced while out on an attempt to gather resources. Where instead what you see in these bottomland, more extensively occupied Dalton settings are these more heavily curated points, recycled, retouched points, made on a variety of raw materials. In the bluff site shelters, we see very few raw materials present in each assemblage, maybe only one raw material and one point represented at each bluff shelter. In this open air site, we have at least 4 raw materials that are readily recognizable, even if they're relatively local and regional varieties of raw materials. I look forward to more extensively exploring the raw material record of the Upper Ozarks. There's some really incredible resources out there for lithic knappers, and I'm excited to sort of explore those potential resource extraction locations more fully as time goes forward. Really interestingly, the utility indexes for the bluff shelter points tend to be quite low. You can see those indicated as green dots on this index, on this expended utility index web that you can see on the left side of your screen. The yellow dots represent Dalton points from the lowland areas of the Limestone Valley. This extended utility gives archaeologists a way to explore how much these projectile points have been curated and have been recycled in toolkits. Now, what's really interesting is the longer these points are active, have longer active use lives, the more that they're resharpened and refastened, the sort of higher their expended utility index will rise. What's really fascinating about these points from the lowland settings is that they have really high expended utility. In the lowland settings, these Dalton points, which are not being destroyed as catastrophically as those that we see deposited in bluff shelters, are recycled again and again. The relationship between the width of the base of these points and the width of the blade of these points, measured at 30 centimeters up the length of the blade, and even their width to thickness ratios, all reveal that these points are being curated for longer, more heavily retouched. They stay in toolkits for extended periods of time. And that contrasts really interestingly with points that we find in these bluff shelter locations, whose base to blade ratio is really low on this index of expended utility. These points are fashioned, they're lashed into hunting weapons, they fail in a catastrophic way, and then they're discarded. They're not recycled. I think it would be really interesting to investigate the earlier chains of lithic reduction that lead to these sort of single-use points or short use life points, and those of more curated Dalton points that show up in more residential assemblages. This is just an example of the kind of work that we're starting to do at Arkansas Tech University. We're really expanding the archaeological research capacity of this campus in exciting ways. We've opened the first archaeological teaching laboratory in the footprint of the Tech Museum on campus. Students are already using this area to learn the basics of lithic analysis, microware use analysis, artifact curation and care processes. This is going to be an incredible resource for the campus going forward. I also want to plug that we're revitalizing the River Valley chapter of the Arkansas Archaeological Survey. I invite all of you to join us when we start doing in-person talks again in October. According to all the guidances put forward by the university, we're excited to be getting back out there and meeting members of the community. This is also a call for collaborations and potential undergraduate research. If you live in the area, if you work in the area, and you have great ideas that you want to see archaeologically investigated, find me, come reach out to me. Let's get undergraduates involved. Let's really boost the research capacity of what's happening at Arkansas Tech University and expand this footprint into this incredible River Valley zone. Coming from a different location, the River Valley, I'm seeing it with fresh eyes, and it just looks like an incredibly rich place for the investigation of Arkansas archaeology in all spans of prehistory. I want to conclude with a special thanks to Arkansas Tech University, who's provided some great funding to get this lab set up and going, to get this research kick-started, to the National Forest Service, and particularly the Ozark St. Francis National Forest, who's been a partner with Arkansas Tech University in making sure these collections are well cared for and well curated. I'm excited to continue our working relationship. Of course, I want to give a shout out to the Arkansas Archaeological Survey. It's such a pleasure to meet you all, and I look forward to talking with you more at our question and answer session. And also a special thanks to you. I know you took time out of your day to watch this, and I really appreciate it. I look forward to fielding your questions. I look forward to getting to know you personally. Thank you again.